Rowena Stiles had 4 months of letters and 1 photograph, and when she stepped off the Northern Pacific at Bozeman in the first week of April 1893, she was carrying both like a kind of armor. The photograph had shown a man in his Sunday clothes, clean-shaved, straight-backed, the kind of face that looked like it had made up its mind about something and intended to stay that way. She had liked the photograph. She had liked it enough to board a train in Dayton, Ohio, and ride it 2,200 miles into a territory she had only ever seen on a map. The man on the platform was not the man in the photograph. He was tall, which matched, but the clean shave was gone, replaced by 3 or 4 days' worth of stubble that had not yet decided if it was a beard. His coat was canvas, not wool, the kind of coat a man wore when he expected to ruin it. There was a scratch along his jaw that looked recent. He was holding his hat in both hands, turning it slowly, like a man who did not know what else to do with himself. And when he saw her step down from the car, his face did not light up. He simply looked at her with a steady, careful expression and said, "Miss Stiles, I'm Conrad Hale. The wagon's around the side." That was it, no smile, no welcome. He picked up her larger bag without asking and started walking. Rowena followed him, and she thought, with the particular clarity of a woman who has made a very large decision and is just now beginning to doubt it, "I have made a serious error in judgment." She was wrong. Not partially wrong. Wrong in the particular way that people are wrong, when they have been right about everything else for so long, that they forget what being wrong feels like. But she would not know that for another 6 weeks, and the knowing would cost her more than she was prepared to pay. I think about Rowena often. I think about the version of her that existed on that platform, smart, capable, absolutely certain she had read the situation correctly. She was a telegraph operator for 9 years before she came to Montana. She was trained to read signals fast and read them right. She had applied that training to a man she had known for 4 months only in writing, and in 1 photograph, and she had found him wanting inside of 30 seconds. The story of what happened next is, among other things, a story about the limits of reading signals fast. Rowena Stiles was 34 years old and had worked the telegraph desk at the Dayton Western Union office since she was 25. She was good at it, fast, accurate, unflappable. She could hold 6 separate messages in her head at once and sort them without error. Her supervisor, a man named Secker, had told her more than once that she was the best operator he had ever trained. And he had meant it as a compliment, and she had taken it as one. And neither of them had thought much about the fact that she had held the same position for 9 years with no prospect of advancement because the company did not promote women above the front desk. She had been engaged once, briefly, to a lawyer named Sterling, who had seemed reasonable until he suggested she quit her position after the wedding, at which point she had suggested she would not be marrying him, and that had been that. By 34, Dayton had come to feel like a room she had memorized. She knew every corner of it and there was nothing left to discover. The advertisement she found in the back pages of a Cincinnati paper was unlike any she had seen. It was tucked between a notice about seed prices and a listing for a boarding house in Billings. It said, "Montana homesteader seeks a partner in the practical sense. I need someone who can read a ledger, argue a point, and make a decision without waiting to be told. Companionship intended, independence guaranteed. Reply to C. Hale, Gallatin County, Montana." Rowena read it 3 times. She had seen matrimonial advertisements before. They were as a rule lists of what the man needed done and what he was willing to offer in return. Cook, keep house, bear children, receive a roof. This one was not that. Argue a point. That was not a phrase a man put in a matrimonial advertisement unless he meant it, and if he meant it, she did not know what to do with that except write back. She wrote a cautious first letter. She told him she was a telegraph operator, that she understood ledgers, that she had opinions and was not in the habit of keeping them to herself. She said she was not coming to Montana to be anyone's cook, and if that was what he was actually after, he ought to say so plainly. Conrad Hale wrote back in 8 days. His letter was not cautious. It was in the way of a man who had been alone for a long time, and had developed opinions about everything, simply because there was no one to tell him he was wrong, immediately argumentative. He disagreed with her assessment of the Western Union's telegraph expansion. He disagreed with her reading of the silver question. He wrote that the homestead had 400 acres and he ran it alone, that it was too much land for one person to manage well, and that he was looking for a mind to work alongside, not a pair of hands to do what he said. She wrote back. This continued for 4 months. His letters were not the letters of an educated man in the formal sense. He had been schooled through the 8th grade in Wisconsin and had taught himself the rest, which was considerable. He had opinions about land law, about irrigation, about the mathematics of timber yield. He asked her questions no man had ever asked her. What she thought about the labor movement, whether a territory the size of Montana could sustain a single economy or needed 3. What she believed about education for children in rural places where school was 12 miles away, and the snow was 5 months deep. She answered everything. He pushed back on half of it and agreed with the other half and always explained why. By the 4th month, Rowena had started looking forward to his letters the way she used to look forward to nothing. Because there had been nothing to look forward to. She had come to trust a mind she had never seen a face to go with. She came to Montana for that mind. She arrived on a platform in Bozeman and was handed a canvas coat, and a man who could not be bothered to shave for the occasion. The homestead was 31 miles from town, which meant 31 miles in a wagon, on roads that had not recovered from the winter. Conrad drove. He did not speak for the first 20 minutes, and Rowena sat beside him in her traveling dress, which was entirely wrong for the temperature and the mud, and catalogued the evidence against him. The wagon needed paint. His boots were cracked at the toe. There was a compass hanging from his belt on a piece of worn leather cord, scratched, dented, the kind of instrument that had been dropped more times than anyone had bothered to count. She thought, this is a man who has let things go. A man who does not take care of what he owns. She had almost decided he was exactly what she feared. Someone who had dressed up his practicality as something finer than it was. Who had advertised for a mind when what he really needed was a woman to manage the disorder he couldn't be bothered to manage himself. Then, he stopped the wagon. Not dramatically. He just pulled the reins easy and sat there a moment, looking at the ridge to the northwest. Then he said, "That's a Clark's nutcracker, up on the dead pine, you see it?" She looked and did not. "Gray bird," he said. "Only bird in North America that caches seeds by memory. Hides close to 10,000 seeds in a season and finds 90% of them months later under 3 feet of snow. Scientists still don't fully understand how. The bird just knows." He watched it a few seconds longer, then clicked the reins and drove on. Rowena said nothing, but she watched the dead pine until it was gone behind them. He spoke 7 more times on the ride. Each time it was because he had noticed something. A change in soil color where the water table was close to the surface. A stand of cottonwood that told him where a creek ran underground. A particular angle of hillside that explained why the grass was better there than 50 yards north. He was not performing knowledge. He was narrating his own landscape the way a person does when they have been watching it alone for so long, that the habit of observation has become something between instinct and need. He was talking to her because he had someone to talk to, and it was clear from the way he said things that this was not a usual condition for him. Somewhere in the 2nd hour, Rowena stopped cataloging his deficiencies. She did not stop being uncertain, but she started listening differently. The homestead was a log house. 2 rooms with a covered porch and a view of the mountains that was the kind of view that made the rest of the world feel slightly less important. Inside it was clean and spare and there were books. More than she had expected. A full shelf of them, and a second row pressed behind the first. Agricultural manuals, survey records, a worn copy of Thoreau, Tocqueville's Democracy in America with pages folded down at every 3rd chapter, and a battered edition of Mills on Liberty that had been read so many times the spine had given up entirely. Conrad showed her to the 2nd room. "I put the better lamp in here," he said. "There's a bolt on the inside. We made an arrangement by letter, and I intend to honor it at whatever pace suits you." He did not say anything further about it. He went out to finish the evening chores. Rowena sat on the edge of the bed in the lamplight for a long time. She had arrived braced for a particular kind of man. The kind who was reasonable by letter and unreasonable in person. Who asked for an equal and then expected a servant. Who would wait until she was too far from home to object before revealing what he actually wanted from her. She was braced for it so thoroughly that for the first 2 weeks she mistook his silence for a trap, his patience for strategy. She kept waiting for the other Conrad to appear. He did not appear because he did not exist. When she said she wanted to understand the timber operation, he spent an entire Sunday walking the stands with her, explaining the rotation system and why he had chosen it. When she disagreed with his method of grading lumber, she thought he was undervaluing the 2nd-grade boards and leaving money behind. He listened to her full argument, went quiet for a day, and then said, "You're right about the grade 2 pricing. I've been doing it wrong for 3 years. He changed it. He did not need to be eased into it. He did not need her to soften the point first. He just corrected course. When she reorganized his account books, which were technically accurate but laid out in a way that made it nearly impossible to see the seasonal cash picture at a glance, he looked at what she had done and said, "Show me how you set this up. Not that's mine, put it back, show me." She had never been with a man who said "show me" and meant it without reservation. By the 2nd month, Rowena was managing the homestead's accounts in full. She found 2 pricing errors with the mill buyer in Bozeman that had cost Conrad money for 4 years running. When she brought it to him, he was quiet for a long moment and then said, "How much total?" she told him. He exhaled slowly, not with anger, and said, "Write him a letter." She wrote the letter. The mill buyer paid what was owed inside 6 weeks. Conrad mentioned to a neighbor at a grain exchange that his accountant had recovered 4 years of losses from one Bozeman buyer in a single letter. The neighbor asked who his accountant was. Conrad said, "My wife." Then after a pause, "Same person, that helps." Rowena heard the story secondhand and thought about it for 2 days. The way he had said it, same person. As if the pairing were self-evident, as if it had never occurred to him to file those things in separate columns. But she was still holding something back. Not from him exactly. From the idea that this was real and was going to hold. She had trusted the letters, and the letters had turned out to be true, and she still could not fully close the distance between what she knew and what she was willing to believe. She had been wrong about him on the platform, and she knew it, and she had not yet admitted it to anyone, including herself. The spring came fast that year. The snowmelt off the Bridger Range hit the Gallatin harder than anyone had seen in a decade, and by the 3rd week of April the creek that crossed the lower pasture had gone from manageable to something else entirely. Rowena had ridden out to check the fence line on the eastern pasture, a task she had taken over, because she was not going to be a woman who waited at the house while someone else worked. She knew the creek was running high. She crossed it at the gravel bar where it was widest and shallowest, the way Conrad had shown her in February when the crossing was nothing, and the morning crossing was fine. She spent 2 hours on the fence line. When she turned back, the creek was not the same creek. The snowmelt had hit a logjam upstream and backed the water and then broken through, all in the course of an afternoon, the way the Gallatin did in big thaw years. The gravel bar was gone under 3 feet of fast brown water moving hard and sideways. Her horse, which was sensible, took one look at it and refused. Rowena dismounted and stood at the bank and understood, with the clean arithmetic of someone who had spent 4 months learning this land from the man who knew it best, that she was not crossing that creek today. She was 4 miles from the house. She had no way to send word. The temperature was dropping with the clouds coming off the range, and she had her work coat and no shelter and maybe 2 hours of light left, and the calculation was not in her favor. She did what she could. She moved to the high ground at the pasture's edge, tied the horse to the fence, wrapped herself in the saddle blanket, and waited. She was not panicking. Rowena Stiles did not panic. She assessed. She assessed her situation carefully, and the assessment was not good. Conrad found her at the hour mark. He had come home from the north pasture and found the house empty and the water up. He had done what he apparently did as a matter of course. Looked for the problem, found her horse's tracks from that morning in the mud, followed them east. He had crossed the flooding creek on foot at a narrow point half a mile upstream where there was still footing on the rocks in water past his knees. In April runoff that was cold enough to make a grown man's hands stop working. He came up the east pasture at a run, calling her name. She heard him and called back, and he changed direction without breaking stride. And when he came over the rise and saw her standing wrapped in a horse blanket at the fence line, the expression on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from him. He stopped for just a moment, completely still. Then he came the rest of the way across to her without another word. He had brought his coat. The canvas coat, the one she had dismissed at the Bozeman platform as the garment of a man who did not respect his own things. He put it around her shoulders without asking. Then he reached down and unclipped the compass from his belt and held it briefly. "I knew which direction you'd gone," he said. "I just needed to find the crossing point." He had used it to navigate to the only upstream ford he remembered, in fading light, across terrain that looked different under floodwater than it did in the dry. He got her back over the creek the same way he had come. Both of them on foot, in cold water up to the thigh, his hand around her wrist the entire time, steady and unhurried, as if the water were a minor inconvenience and she were something worth being careful with. That night, sitting by the stove with her hands around a cup of coffee, and the feeling slowly returning to her feet, Rowena said, "When I got off the train I thought I had made a mistake." Her voice was level. She had decided to say it. Conrad was across the table. He did not look surprised. He said, "I know." She looked at him. "You knew." "You had that look," he said. "The look of a person doing arithmetic in their head and not liking what it adds up to." "And you said nothing." "What would I have said?" He set down his cup. "You'd made a judgment on incomplete information. Only thing that fixes incomplete information is more information. I couldn't hand that to you. I'd have been talking about myself, and I'm the least reliable source on that subject." He looked at her the way he looked at things he was genuinely trying to understand, which was the way he looked at most things. "I figured you'd see it when you were ready to see it. You don't miss much." Rowena sat with that, then she said, "I judged you by your coat." Conrad glanced toward the door where the canvas coat hung, still damp at the hem. "It's kept me dry for 11 years, he said without any particular edge to it. "It's a good coat." "I know that now," she said. "I know you know," he said. That was the whole of it. It was enough. The marriage that had been an arrangement on paper became something else over the years that followed. Not because of the flood. Though the flood was the crack that let the light through. But because Rowena Stiles finally stopped waiting for Conrad Hale to become someone smaller than his letters had promised, he never did. He was, to a degree she had not fully credited, exactly what he had said. He was in an advertisement placed in the back pages of a Cincinnati paper, a man with a working mind and 400 acres and a singular incapacity for pretending to be anything he wasn't. She ran the accounts and negotiated the mill contracts and started a lending collection in Bozeman that grew, in time, into the county's first permanent library. Conrad managed the land and the timber, and built a bridge over the creek by himself that the county road engineer said could not be done without a professional survey crew, and the bridge did not shift. They argued about water rights, about tariffs, about the proper management of the South pasture, about whether Teddy Roosevelt was a better man than his press suggested, about the correct way to make coffee and the correct number of blankets required in December. The arguing was the best part, and both of them knew it. They had 2 children. Both were taught to read by Rowena and to read the land by Conrad. Both left for the university at Missoula, and both came back after, because the homestead was the kind of place people come back to when they have seen enough of other places to know what a good one feels like. Rowena kept the compass. The dented, scratched, barely legible compass Conrad had worn on his belt every working day for 15 years before she ever knew his name. After he was gone, she kept it on the windowsill in the room that had been hers first, the room with the bolt on the inside of the door that she had stopped using within the first month. Conrad Hale died in 1924 at 68. Rowena lived until 1939. She was 79. Her granddaughter found the compass on the windowsill one afternoon, and turned it over in her hands and asked why her grandmother kept such a battered old thing, when it barely even worked anymore. Rowena took it from her and held it a moment before she answered. Then she said, "Because the man who carried this never once got lost, not in those mountains, not in this marriage, not in his own mind, and on the day I needed finding, when the water was up and the light was going and I had miscalculated, he knew exactly which direction I was in. He came without hesitating." She set the compass back on the sill, and I had decided what kind of man he was before I ever let him speak 2 sentences. I judged him by his coat. By a scratched compass I thought was worthless. I was wrong about every single thing I decided in those first 2 minutes on that platform. She was quiet a moment. I keep it to remember what that kind of wrong feels like, so I don't make it again. I have thought about Rowena Stiles for a long time. About that woman on the platform holding her 4 months of letters and her telegraph operator's certainty that she knew how to read a signal. She could read signals. She was very good at it. She just could not read Conrad Hale from the surface, because Conrad Hale was almost entirely depth, and depth does not show up in canvas coats or stubble or a compass on a worn leather cord. What she had trusted in the letters was real. What she saw on the platform was also real. The trouble was that she assumed the surface contradicted the letters, when in fact it confirmed them exactly. It was the portrait of a man who spent his energy on things that mattered, and had genuinely never gotten around to caring about the things that didn't. Tell me, have you ever been absolutely certain about someone in the first minute you met them, and when you found out how wrong you were, did you say so out loud? Because most of us have stood on that platform. Most of us have done that arithmetic in our heads, and not liked the answer, and been so certain we were right that we nearly walked away from the truest thing we were ever going to find. The question is whether someone was patient enough to let us see it, and whether we were honest enough to say when we finally did, "I was wrong, and I am grateful you waited." If this story stayed with you, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. And if you want another story about the distance between the person we decide someone is and the person they actually turn out to be, it's right here.